Hey, good morning, everybody. Hopefully, you are enjoying your morning like I am. Hopefully, you're enjoying this devotional series. Maybe you're just stumbling upon it for the first time, even better. But we're going to look at the topic of the righteousness of Christ today and really how Christ's righteousness interacts with the law of God. We've been looking at Dietrich Bonhoeffer's The Cost of Discipleship, kind of going through chapter by chapter, highlighting certain sections. So, kind of morphing this into my own devotional, but kind of using that as a guide in case you're familiar with the work, or if you're not familiar with the work, you'll obviously notice that I'm not hitting on everything, but definitely a good book to check out. Very old book. If you missed my initial devotional in this series, Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran pastor in Germany. He was a martyr by the Nazis. He was killed for standing against the Nazis. And so he, even prior to that, he took a stand really for the gospel over and against kind of the soft state religion, kind of the idea that everyone's a Christian just because you were born into a Christian nation, right? So he's kind of challenging these ideas. But let's look at today at Matthew 17 through 20. Think not that I have come to destroy the law and the prophets. I came not to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or tittle shall in no wise pass away from the law till all things be accomplished. Whosoever, therefore, shall break one of the least commandments and shall teach men so, or likewise, shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall in no wise enter into the kingdom of heaven. So we see a clear command there that Jesus is saying, hey, the law of God is still binding. Don't think that I've come to do away with it. I've rather come to fulfill it. Now, this has caused debate for centuries as to in what regard, to what degree. Others have even said the Sermon on the Mount does not belong in the New Testament. It belongs part of the Old Testament or Old Covenant. So although it's written in the New Testament, it's part of the Old Covenantal system until after Christ's death, that becomes the New Covenant. So some would say the Sermon on the Mount was applicable only to the Jews in that time. And so we could see there's a vast difference if we think that somehow these verses are not binding upon us now versus if they are binding. Reformed theology, which I'm a part of, has tended to see the law of God being, a guide. One, it convicts the Christian, it convicts the world of sin. It convicts the Christian also, right? It's a guide to life. So it's his moral guide. So we see multiple uses of the law of God. We're not saved by rituals or things of that nature, but rather it's for the believer and for the unbeliever in that there are laws, right? We don't murder. There's laws against theft, things of that nature. But let's look at what Bonhoeffer says, because I think he really, again, Bonhoeffer's this guy that really just comes down to challenge the status quo. He wants to break you out of your mold a little bit, if I'm reading him correctly. So he asks this question: how is this to be understood? We know that Jesus is speaking to his own followers, to men who owe an exclusive allegiance to himself. He had allowed no law to act as a barrier to his fellowship with his disciples. We saw that when we were dealing with Luke 5:57, discipleship means adherence to Jesus Christ alone. And immediately, but now comes the surprise. The disciples are bound to the Old Testament law. This has a double significance. First, it means that adherence to the law is something quite different from the following of Christ. And secondly, it means that any adherence to his person that disregards the law is equally removed from following him. It is, however, Jesus himself who points to the law, those to whom he has granted his whole promise and his whole fellowship. Because it is their Lord who does this, they are bound to acknowledge the law. The question inevitably arises, which is our final authority, Christ or the law? To which are we bound? Christ had said that no law was to be allowed to come between him and his disciples. Now he tells us that to abandon the law would mean to separate ourselves from him. What exactly does he mean? The law refers to is the law of the Old Covenant, not a new law, but the law which he quoted to the rich young man and the lawyer when they wanted to know the revealed will of God. It becomes a new law only because it is Christ who binds his followers to it. For Christians, therefore, the law is not a better law than that of the Pharisees, but one and the same. Every letter of it, every jot and every tittle must remain in force and be observed until the end of the world. But there is a better righteousness, which is to be expected of Christians. Without it, none can enter into the kingdom of heaven, for it is the indispensable condition of discipleship. None can have this better righteousness, but to those whom Christ is speaking here, those whom he has called. The call of Christ, in fact, Christ himself, is the sine qua non of this better righteousness. So to summarize this, so we don't get too long, Bonhoeffer is simply saying the law of God doesn't change. It's still binding on the Christian. The difference now is we have a better law fulfiller. The Pharisees did so hypocritically. Christ does so completely, and he brings us into that as we look to him. So the believer doesn't have to try and look at the law per se and say, I have to obey this, I have to obey that, but it is binding, right? If we murder or steal or break God's moral commands, these are going to be egregious sins. But as we walk after Christ now, we will not walk in those paths. Now this is a little bit of my reading into, injecting into Bonhoeffer, and I don't think that was a complete summary of him, just to be clear. But I think what he's trying to really hit on is the righteousness of Christ in fulfilling the law. And he's clearly saying that the law has not been abrogated. The law of God in the Old Covenant is not completely done away with. It is not of no value to us. It's of complete value. It's still binding, but it's only Christ who can fulfill it, so we have to trust in Christ. Hopefully that makes sense, guys. We'll come back to part 2 of this tomorrow. Have a blessed day.